Elena Marsh saw him the moment she stepped off the train, and her whole body went cold. Ryan Cole was standing near the ticket machines, scanning the crowd with the kind of focus that made her stomach twist. He had found her again. She did not know how, but he had found her, and now he was walking toward her, with slow, purposeful steps, the way a man walks when he already believes he has won. Elena's hands began to shake. She gripped the strap of her bag and looked left, then right, searching for an exit, a guard, anything. The station was full of people rushing to catch their trains, none of them looking at her, none of them seeing what she saw. Ryan was close now, close enough that she could see the small, satisfied smile forming on his face. She had spent 6 months building walls between herself and him. She had changed her phone number twice. She had moved apartments. She had told her friends never to mention where she worked. And still, here he was, walking toward her, as if none of that mattered, as if she belonged to him, no matter what she did. Her mind raced. There was no time to run, no time to call for help. So she did the only thing she could think of. She turned to the nearest stranger, a tall man in a dark gray coat who was checking his watch, and she grabbed his arm. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, just play along. My ex is right behind me, and I need him to think I'm with someone." The man looked down at her, startled. For a moment, Elena feared he would pull away, would ask questions, would make a scene. Instead, something in his expression shifted. He studied her face for a brief second, saw the fear there, and understood. "All right," he said quietly, and to her surprise, his voice was calm, steady, almost reassuring. "Stay close to me." He placed a gentle hand at the small of her back, not forceful, not possessive, just enough to complete the illusion. Elena leaned into him, her heart pounding so hard she was certain he could feel it. Ryan's steps slowed as he approached. His eyes moved from Elena to the man beside her, and his smile faltered. "Elena," he said, his voice carrying that familiar edge, the one that used to make her flinch before she had learned to recognize it as a warning sign. "Who is this?" "Someone who doesn't appreciate you speaking to my girlfriend that way," the stranger said before Elena could answer. His tone was mild, almost pleasant, but there was something underneath it, a quiet authority that made Ryan take a half step back. "Girlfriend," Ryan repeated, his eyes narrowing. He looked Elena up and down, as if trying to find the lie in her expression. "Since when?" "Since it's none of your business," Elena said, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. Standing beside this stranger, she felt something she had not felt in a long time. She felt safe. Ryan's jaw tightened. For a moment, Elena thought he might push the confrontation further, the way he always used to, refusing to back down until he got what he wanted. But something about the stranger's calm, unblinking gaze seemed to give him pause. Ryan glanced at the man's watch, at his coat, at the quiet confidence in his posture, and something in his calculations seemed to change. "This isn't over," Ryan muttered, though the words sounded less certain than he probably intended. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd, and Elena felt her knees nearly give out with relief. "Are you all right?" the stranger asked, releasing her gently, once Ryan was out of sight. Elena let out a shaky breath. "I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have grabbed you like that. I panicked." "You don't need to apologize," he said. "You looked like you needed help. I'm glad I could give it." She studied him properly for the first time. He was tall, with dark hair combed neatly back, and sharp features that seemed almost too composed for a crowded train station. His coat was well-tailored, simple in design but clearly expensive, the kind of quality that did not announce itself loudly, but was unmistakable to anyone who looked closely. There was something about the way he stood, straight-backed, unhurried, that made him look as though he belonged somewhere far grander than this platform. "I'm Elena," she said, still catching her breath. "Alexander," he replied, offering a small, polite smile. "Thank you, Alexander. Really. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't played along." "You looked like you had a plan," he said. "I just helped you carry it out." Elena laughed, a short, surprised sound, the first genuine laugh she had allowed herself in weeks. That's a generous way of putting it. They stood there for a moment, the noise of the station swirling around them, neither quite sure how to end the conversation. Alexander glanced toward the exit, then back at her. Do you have someone to walk you home? He asked. That man didn't seem like the type to give up easily. Elena's smile faded slightly. No, it's just me. Alexander considered this for a moment. I have a car outside. Let me take you home, just to be safe. Every instinct in Elena's body told her to say no. She had learned, painfully, not to trust strangers, not to let anyone get close too quickly. But something about Alexander's steady, unhurried manner made her hesitate before refusing. He was not pushing, he was not insisting, he was simply offering and leaving the choice entirely in her hands. You don't have to do that, she said. I know I don't have to, he replied. I'd like to. There was something disarming about his honesty, the way he did not try to convince her with flattery or persistence, just stated his intention plainly and let her decide. Elena found herself nodding before she had fully made up her mind. All right, she said, thank you. He led her out of the station to where a sleek black car waited at the curb, a driver standing beside it, who opened the door the moment he saw them approaching. Elena slid into the back seat, noting the quiet luxury of the interior, the soft leather, the faint scent of cedar, and something clean and expensive. She told herself it was simply a nice car, nothing more. Alexander seemed like a successful businessman, and successful businessmen drove nice cars. That was all. Where to? The driver asked. Elena gave her address, feeling strange saying it out loud to a stranger, but Alexander only nodded and settled into the seat beside her, keeping a respectful distance. You don't have to tell me what happened back there, he said, as the car pulled away from the curb. But if you ever need to talk about it, I'm a good listener. Elena looked at him, surprised again by his restraint. Most people, upon witnessing something like that, would have pressed for details immediately, hungry for the story. Alexander seemed content to let her share only what she wanted to share, when she wanted to share it. He's my ex, she said finally, staring out the window at the city lights blurring past. We were together for 2 years. It ended badly. He doesn't seem to understand that it's over. I'm sorry, Alexander said simply, without pity in his voice, just quiet understanding. That sounds exhausting. It is, Elena admitted. I thought moving apartments would help. I thought changing my number would help. Nothing seems to work. Have you gone to the police? I have a restraining order, she said. It hasn't stopped him from showing up places. He's careful. He never quite crosses the line that would get him arrested. He just lingers, watches, waits. Alexander was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had an edge of something Elena could not quite place, a controlled kind of seriousness. That must be frightening. It is, she admitted again, surprised at how easy it was to say these things to him, a man she had known for less than 20 minutes. Perhaps it was easier, because he was a stranger, someone with no connection to her life, no way to judge her or gossip about her. Or perhaps it was simply the calm, steady way he listened, as though her words mattered, as though she mattered. The car slowed outside her apartment building a few minutes later. Elena reached for the door handle, then hesitated, turning back to him. Thank you again, she said. For everything. You didn't have to help a stranger like that. I think most people would have, Alexander said, though something in his tone suggested he did not entirely believe that himself. Not the way you did, Elena said. You didn't ask questions. You didn't make it complicated. You just helped. Alexander reached into his coat and produced a plain white card, offering it to her. There was no elaborate crest, no flashy logo, just a name and a phone number printed in simple black type. In case he shows up again, he said, you can call me. Elena took the card, turning it over in her fingers. I can't ask you to keep rescuing me. You're not asking, Alexander said. I'm offering. There's a difference. She looked up at him, searching his face for some hidden motive, some angle she was missing, but found only quiet sincerity. All right, she said softly. Thank you, Alexander. Good night, Elena, he replied. Be safe. She stepped out of the car and watched it pull away into the night, the card still warm in her hand from where she had been holding it. As she climbed the stairs to her apartment, her mind kept circling back to him, to the calm certainty in his voice, to the way he had stood so easily between her and the fear that had been chasing her for months. She told herself it meant nothing. A kind stranger had helped her out of a difficult moment, and that was the end of it. She would probably never see him again. But as she locked her apartment door behind her and set the card on her kitchen counter, she found herself hoping that was not true. Later that night, unable to sleep, Elena sat by her window, watching the street below, half expecting to see Ryan's car parked somewhere in the shadows. The street was empty. For the first time in weeks, she felt something close to calm settle over her. A fragile peace she was almost afraid to trust. She picked up the card again, running her thumb over the raised lettering of Alexander's name. There was nothing about it that told her who he really was, nothing that hinted at the truth she would not discover for weeks. To her, in that quiet moment, he was simply a kind man who had helped her when she needed it most. A stranger who had, for a few brief minutes, made her feel safe. She had no way of knowing that this simple act of desperation, grabbing a stranger's arm in a crowded train station, was about to change the entire course of her life. She had no way of knowing that the man beside whom she had pretended to belong was about to become someone she could not imagine her life without. All she knew, as she finally climbed into bed that night, was that, for the first time in a long time, she had slept without fear. The next morning, Elena woke to sunlight streaming through her curtains, and the strange, unfamiliar sensation of having rested well. She lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the previous evening in her mind. Ryan's face, the panic, the stranger's steady hand at her back, his calm voice cutting through the chaos. She got up and went about her morning routine, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Alexander. She told herself it was simple curiosity, nothing more. He had been kind to her, and people were not always kind for no reason. There had to be something else, some catch she had not yet discovered. At work that day, her co-worker Nora noticed she seemed different. "You look less tired today," Nora said, setting a cup of coffee on Elena's desk. "Did something happen?" Elena hesitated, unsure how much to share. "Ryan showed up at the train station last night." Nora's face fell immediately. "Oh, Elena, are you okay?" "I'm okay," Elena said, and to her surprise, she meant it. "Someone helped me. A stranger. He pretended to be my boyfriend, to get Ryan to back off." Nora raised an eyebrow. "A stranger just agreed to that?" "He didn't even ask questions," Elena said, smiling slightly at the memory. "He just helped." "Do you think you'll see him again?" Elena glanced at her bag, where Alexander's card was tucked safely inside her wallet. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe." She spent the rest of the day distracted, her mind wandering back to the card, to the quiet certainty in Alexander's voice when he had told her to call if she needed help. She was not the type to rely on others. She had learned, through painful experience, that trusting too quickly led to heartbreak. But something about Alexander felt different, safer, though she could not explain why. That evening, walking home from the bus stop, Elena kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see Ryan's familiar shape lurking somewhere in the shadows. The street was quiet, empty, except for a few other pedestrians hurrying home in the cooling evening air. She quickened her pace anyway, old habits refusing to let go so easily. By the time she reached her apartment, her nerves had settled slightly. She made herself dinner, sat by the window with a book she did not really read, and found her thoughts circling back, again and again, to the stranger who had so calmly stepped into her crisis and calmed it without hesitation. She did not know his last name. She did not know what he did for a living, where he lived, or anything about his life beyond the plain white card sitting in her wallet. And yet, she found herself hoping, quietly, that their paths would cross again. She had no idea just how soon that hope would be answered, or how dramatically her life was about to change. 3 days passed without any sign of Ryan, and Elena began to let herself breathe again. She went to work, came home, cooked simple meals, and tried to convince herself that the incident at the train station had been an isolated moment of bad luck, rather than a warning of things to come. She did not call the number on Alexander's card. She told herself it would be strange to call a man she had known for only a few minutes, no matter how kind he had been. But on the 4th day, everything changed. Elena worked at a small marketing firm in the city center, a modest office on the 3rd floor of an old brick building. She had always liked her job, liked the quiet rhythm of her days, the familiar faces of her coworkers, the predictable routine that made her feel grounded. That afternoon, she was reviewing a client presentation at her desk when Nora leaned over the partition between their desks, her face pale. "Elena," Nora whispered, "there's a man downstairs asking for you. He says he's your boyfriend." Elena's stomach dropped. She did not need to ask who it was. "Tell him I'm not here," she said, her voice barely steady. "I already tried that," Nora said. "He's not leaving. The receptionist is getting nervous." Elena's hands trembled as she stood up. She could feel her coworkers glancing at her, sensing something was wrong, even if they did not know the details. She walked to the window that overlooked the street below, and saw him there, pacing near the entrance of the building, occasionally looking up toward the windows, as if he could sense exactly where she was. Ryan Cole had a way of making himself impossible to ignore. He was not shouting, not causing an obvious scene, but there was something about the tense set of his shoulders, the restless energy in his pacing, that made it clear he was not going to simply walk away. Elena's mind raced. She could call security, but the building's security was minimal, just an elderly guard who worked the front desk and rarely dealt with anything more serious than a delivery dispute. She could call the police, but she had done that before, and by the time they arrived, Ryan was always long gone, leaving her looking paranoid and dramatic in front of officers who had grown weary of the repeated calls. Her hand found her wallet in her bag, before she had fully decided what to do. She pulled out Alexander's card, staring at the number printed there, and before she could second-guess herself, she dialed it. He answered on the second ring. "Elena," he said, and something in the way he said her name, warm and immediate, steadied her nerves slightly. "Is everything all right?" "He's here," she said, her voice shaking, despite her efforts to control it. "Ryan. He's outside my office. He won't leave." There was a brief pause, and when Alexander spoke again, his voice had changed, still calm, but sharper now, more focused. "Where is your office?" She gave him the address, her hands trembling as she spoke. "Stay inside," he said. "Stay away from the windows. I'll be there soon." "You don't have to come," Elena said, even as relief flooded through her at the thought of him doing exactly that. "I could call the police." "You can do both," Alexander said, "but I'm already on my way." The call ended, and Elena stood there for a moment, staring at her phone, wondering if she had made a mistake by calling him at all. But there was no time to dwell on it. Nora appeared at her side again, her expression tight with worry. "He's asking the receptionist to let him up," Nora said. "She's telling him no, but he's getting louder." Elena moved away from the window, her heart hammering. She thought about the restraining order sitting uselessly in a drawer at home, about the months of careful planning that had failed to keep Ryan away, about the exhausting cycle of fear that never seemed to end no matter what she did. 10 minutes felt like an hour. Elena paced near the back of the office, unable to focus on anything, jumping at every sound from the stairwell. When her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, she nearly dropped it. "I'm here. Come to the lobby when you're ready. He won't bother you again today." Elena stared at the message, unsure whether to trust the confidence in those simple words. She made her way cautiously toward the stairs, Nora following a few steps behind, both of them peering down into the lobby as they descended. What she saw stopped her in her tracks. Ryan stood near the entrance, his face flushed with anger, but he was not shouting anymore. He was staring at Alexander, who stood between him and the elevator, his posture relaxed, but unmistakably immovable, like a wall that had decided to take the shape of a man. Two other men stood a short distance behind Alexander, dressed in plain dark suits, quiet and watchful, though neither of them said a word. "This doesn't concern you," Ryan was saying, his voice tight with frustration. "This is between me and Elena." "Elena has made it very clear that she doesn't want you here," Alexander replied, his tone even, almost pleasant, though there was steel underneath it. "I'd suggest you respect that." "You don't know anything about us," Ryan snapped. "I know enough," Alexander said. "I know that a woman who has moved twice and changed her number twice to get away from you clearly does not want you in her life. I know that showing up at her workplace, after everything she's done to create distance, is not the behavior of someone who respects her wishes." Ryan's jaw clenched, his eyes flicking briefly to the two men standing behind Alexander, before returning to Alexander himself. Something in his expression shifted, a flicker of uncertainty breaking through his anger. "Who exactly do you think you are?" Ryan demanded. "Someone who is asking you, politely, to leave," Alexander said. "I would prefer this stays polite, but I want to be clear that I am prepared to make sure you leave, one way or another." The quiet certainty in his voice seemed to land harder than any shout could have. Ryan glanced once more at the two men behind Alexander, then at the receptionist, who had already picked up the phone, presumably to call security or the police. Something in the calculation of the moment seemed to tip against him. "This isn't over," Ryan muttered, echoing the same words he had said at the train station days earlier, though this time his voice carried far less conviction. He turned and walked out through the glass doors, disappearing down the street without looking back. Elena let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, and hurried down the remaining stairs, Nora close behind her. "Are you all right?" Alexander asked, turning to face her, his expression softening from the controlled sternness he had shown Ryan into something gentler, more concerned. "I'm fine," Elena said, though her voice still trembled slightly. "Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come." "You would have handled it," Alexander said, "but I'm glad I could help." Nora was staring between them with undisguised curiosity, and Elena suddenly remembered they were not alone. "Alexander, this is my coworker Nora. Nora, this is Alexander." "Nice to meet you," Nora said, though her eyes lingered on the two men standing quietly near the door, on the general sense of quiet power radiating from the small group. That was impressive. Alexander offered a polite smile, but said nothing further about it, turning his attention back to Elena. "Is there somewhere private we could talk for a moment?" Elena led him to a small conference room near the lobby, leaving Nora to explain the commotion to their curious coworkers. Once the door closed behind them, Elena finally allowed herself to sag slightly against the table, the adrenaline of the last 20 minutes draining out of her, all at once. "I'm sorry you had to deal with that," she said. "I shouldn't have called you. This isn't your problem." "I offered to help," Alexander reminded her gently. "You didn't force me into anything, and for what it's worth, I don't regret coming." Elena studied him for a moment, taking in the same calm composure she had noticed the first night they met, the way he seemed entirely unbothered by the confrontation that had just taken place, as though handling difficult situations was simply second nature to him. "Who were those men with you?" she asked. "Colleagues," Alexander said simply, and something in the careful neutrality of his tone told her he was not going to elaborate further. "You handled that so easily," Elena said, "like you deal with things like this all the time." Alexander's expression flickered briefly, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, before he masked it with a small, wry smile. "I've had some experience managing difficult situations," he said. "It comes with certain responsibilities I have." "What kind of responsibilities?" "Nothing particularly interesting," he said, deflecting smoothly. "Are you all right to go back to work, or would you prefer to leave for the day? I can have someone take you home if you'd like." Elena noticed the deflection, but did not push. She was too grateful, too relieved, to interrogate him further in that moment. "I think I need to go back to work," she said. "If I leave now, it'll feel like he won." Alexander nodded, seeming to understand the logic behind her decision, without needing further explanation. "I respect that. But please, call me if he comes back. I mean that." "You've already done so much," Elena said. "I can't keep relying on you like this." "You're not relying on me," Alexander said, echoing his words from their first meeting. "I'm offering. There's a difference." Elena felt something warm and unfamiliar bloom in her chest, a feeling she had not allowed herself in a long time, something dangerously close to hope. She pushed it down, reminding herself that trusting too quickly had cost her dearly before. "Thank you, Alexander," she said. "Truly. Would you like to have dinner with me sometime?" he asked, the question surprising her with its directness after his earlier careful deflections. "Not because you need saving, just because I'd like to know you better." Elena hesitated. Every rational part of her mind told her to be cautious, to take things slowly, to remember the painful lessons of her past relationship. But there was something about Alexander, something steady and genuine, that made her want to say yes, despite her fear. "I'd like that," she said finally. Alexander's answering smile was small but unmistakably pleased. "I'll call you," he said. "Take care of yourself, Elena." He left shortly after, the two quiet men falling into step behind him as he walked out of the building and into a black car waiting at the curb. Elena watched from the lobby window as the car pulled away, her mind spinning with questions she had not thought to ask. Who was Alexander, really? What kind of work required him to have people who followed him so silently, so watchfully? What kind of responsibilities gave a man that particular blend of calm authority and quiet power? She did not have answers yet, but for the first time in a long time, she found herself looking forward to finding out. That evening, as she rode the bus home, glancing occasionally over her shoulder out of habit rather than genuine fear, Elena allowed herself to think about the dinner Alexander had proposed. She wondered what he would order, what he would talk about when the conversation was not centered around danger and rescue, what he was like when the world was not asking something difficult of him. She realized, with a small jolt of surprise, that she was excited. Not anxious, not guarded, but genuinely excited, in a way she had not felt in longer than she could remember. Ryan's shadow still lingered somewhere at the edges of her thoughts, a persistent worry she could not fully shake. But for the first time since their relationship had ended, that shadow no longer felt like the only thing defining her life. There was something else now, something new and uncertain, and full of possibility, and its name was Alexander. Their dinner took place at a quiet restaurant tucked away on a side street, the kind of place Elena would never have found on her own, understated from the outside, but clearly refined once she stepped through the door. Soft lighting, hushed conversations, and an attentive staff, who seemed to know Alexander by more than just his face. "You come here often?" Elena asked, as they were seated at a corner table. "Often enough," Alexander said, though he did not elaborate further, and Elena noticed, not for the first time, how skillfully he avoided questions that might reveal too much about himself. Conversation flowed more easily than Elena expected. Alexander asked about her work, her interests, the small details of her life that had nothing to do with Ryan, or danger, or rescue. He listened attentively when she spoke about her love of painting, a hobby she had set aside during her relationship with Ryan, and had only recently begun to rediscover. "You should show me sometime," Alexander said, and there was genuine interest in his voice, not the polite feigned curiosity she had grown used to from men who were only pretending to care. "They're not very good," Elena said, laughing softly. "I doubt that," Alexander replied. "You strike me as someone who is careful and precise in everything you do." Elena felt herself relaxing further into the conversation, into the warmth of his attention. She asked him questions in return, curious despite herself, but noticed how deftly he redirected each one, answering just enough to seem forthcoming, while revealing almost nothing concrete. "What do you do for work?" she asked at one point. "I manage a number of properties and investments," he said. "It keeps me busier than I'd like most days." "That's vague," she said, smiling to soften the observation. "It's complicated," Alexander admitted, a flicker of something uncomfortable crossing his face before he smoothed it away. "I'd rather talk about you, if that's all right." Elena let it go, though the curiosity lingered at the back of her mind. There was clearly something Alexander was not telling her, some part of his life he was keeping carefully guarded. She told herself it was not her business to pry, that everyone was entitled to their privacy, especially so early in whatever this was between them. As the evening wore on, she found herself laughing more freely than she had in months, the tension that had lived in her shoulders for so long, slowly easing under the warmth of good food and easy conversation. Alexander had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard more than once, delivering observations with such a straight face that it took her a moment to realize he was joking. "You're funnier than I expected," she told him at one point. "Is that a compliment?" he asked, one eyebrow raised. "It's definitely a compliment," she said, and meant it. By the time the evening ended and Alexander walked her to the car waiting outside, Elena felt lighter than she had in a long time. He did not push for anything more than a comfortable goodbye, simply thanking her for the evening and telling her he hoped to see her again soon. Over the following 2 weeks, they saw each other several times, coffee after work, a walk through a quiet park on a Sunday afternoon, a visit to a small art gallery where Elena finally worked up the courage to show him a few photographs of her paintings on her phone, watching nervously as he studied each one with genuine attention rather than polite dismissal. "These are beautiful," he said, and the sincerity in his voice made her flush with pleasure. Ryan did not resurface during those weeks, and Elena allowed herself, cautiously, to believe that perhaps the confrontation at her office had finally convinced him to stay away. She still glanced over her shoulder, out of habit, still felt her chest tighten whenever she saw a car that resembled his, but the fear no longer consumed her the way it once had. Nora, ever perceptive, noticed the change immediately. "You're different lately," she observed one afternoon as they worked side by side. "Lighter." "I feel lighter," Elena admitted. "It's the Alexander effect," Nora said with a knowing smile. "So when do I get to meet him properly? All I got was a 2-minute introduction while he was scaring off your ex." Elena laughed. "Maybe soon." "He's handsome," Nora added, in a very put-together, expensive sort of way. "Where did you say he worked again?" "I didn't," Elena admitted. "He's kind of private about it." Nora's eyebrows rose slightly. "Private how?" "I don't know," Elena said, considering the question seriously for the first time. "He just changes the subject whenever I ask. He says he manages properties and investments, but he's never specific about what that means." "That's a little strange, don't you think?" Elena had thought about it, more than once, in the quiet moments before sleep, but every time doubt crept in, she reminded herself of how he had looked at her that first night, how calmly and completely he had stepped in to help a stranger, without any expectation of reward. Whatever he was hiding, it did not feel malicious. It felt more like caution, like a man who had learned, for reasons unknown to her, to guard certain parts of himself carefully. "I trust him," Elena said finally. "I don't know why, but I do." "Just be careful," Nora said, not unkindly. "You've been hurt before." "I know," Elena said quietly. "Believe me, I know." That evening, walking home from the bus stop, lost in thought about the conversation with Nora, Elena barely noticed the car that slowed beside her until it was too late to avoid it entirely. Her stomach dropped as she recognized the vehicle, and a moment later, Ryan stepped out onto the sidewalk in front of her, blocking her path. "We need to talk," he said, his voice carrying that familiar mixture of desperation and anger that always made her chest tighten with old, learned fear. "There's nothing to talk about, Ryan," Elena said, trying to keep her voice steady even as her pulse raced. "I've told you that already." "Who is he?" Ryan demanded, ignoring her attempt to end the conversation. "That man from your office. Who does he think he is, threatening me like that?" "He wasn't threatening you," Elena said. "He was protecting me, which is more than you've ever done." Ryan's face contorted with anger at the accusation. "I loved you," he snapped. "Everything I did because I loved you." "You scared me," Elena said, her voice trembling now despite her efforts. "Constantly. You made me feel like I couldn't breathe without checking with you first. That's not love, Ryan." For a moment, something flickered across Ryan's face, something that almost looked like genuine hurt, before it hardened back into anger. "You'll regret this," he said. "Whoever this new guy is, he doesn't know you the way I do. He doesn't know what you're really like." "I think he knows enough," Elena said, standing straighter, despite the fear still coursing through her. "Now please, leave me alone." She stepped around him and continued walking, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he could hear it. To her relief, Ryan did not follow, though she could feel his eyes on her back until she turned the corner, and he disappeared from view. Once she was safely inside her apartment, door locked behind her, Elena's hands finally began to shake as the adrenaline of the confrontation wore off. She sank onto her couch, pulling her knees up to her chest, and allowed herself a few minutes to simply breathe. Her phone buzzed with a message from Alexander, as though he had somehow sensed her distress from wherever he was. "How was your day?" Elena stared at the message for a long moment before typing her reply, debating whether to mention what had happened. Eventually, honesty won out. Ryan showed up again, on my walk home. "I'm okay, just shaken." The reply came almost instantly. "I'm coming over, is that all right?" Elena hesitated only briefly, before typing her response. Yes, please. 20 minutes later, there was a soft knock at her door. She opened it to find Alexander standing there, his expression a careful mixture of concern and restrained anger, an emotion she had not yet seen from him. Are you hurt? He asked immediately, stepping inside once she waved him in. No, Elena said, just scared. He blocked my path on the way home. He wanted to know about you. Alexander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. What did you tell him? Nothing important, Elena said. I told him you were protecting me. He didn't like that. I imagine not, Alexander said, his voice quiet, but carrying an edge. Elena had not heard from him before. He sat down beside her on the couch, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, far enough that it did not feel presumptuous. Elena, I want you to know that whatever this becomes between us, I take your safety seriously. I won't let him hurt you. You barely know me, Elena said softly. Why do you care this much? Alexander was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer carefully. Because from the very first moment I met you, grabbing my arm at that train station, terrified and trying so hard to hide it, I saw something in you I don't see very often. Strength. Even in your fear, you were fighting. That's rare, and it matters to me. Elena felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, unexpected and overwhelming. I'm tired of being afraid, she admitted quietly. I know, Alexander said, and I want to help you stop being afraid, if you'll let me. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while after that, the tension slowly draining from Elena's shoulders as the warmth of his presence settled around her like a shield. She did not know, in that moment, the full truth of who Alexander really was, the title he carried, the world he came from. She only knew that beside him, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something close to safe. It was a feeling she intended to hold on to for as long as she could, even as the shadows of both her past and Alexander's carefully guarded secrets lingered somewhere just out of sight, waiting to be revealed. Weeks passed, and Elena found herself falling into an easy rhythm with Alexander, one built on quiet dinners, long conversations, and a steadily growing trust that surprised her with how naturally it had formed. He called her every evening, sometimes just to ask about her day, sometimes to share a small observation that had made him think of her. He never pushed for more than she was ready to give, never made her feel rushed or pressured. And in that patience, Elena found herself opening up more than she had with anyone since Ryan. She told him about her childhood, about growing up in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, about her mother's insistence that she pursue something practical instead of art, about the quiet rebellion of taking painting classes in secret until she was old enough to make her own choices. Alexander listened to all of it with the same careful attention he gave everything, asking thoughtful questions, remembering small details she had mentioned only in passing weeks earlier. In turn, Alexander shared pieces of himself, though Elena noticed he was always careful about which pieces he chose. He told her about his love of old books, his complicated relationship with his mother, his tendency to overwork himself until exhaustion forced him to slow down. But whenever the conversation drifted toward his profession, toward the specifics of his daily life, he would smoothly redirect, and Elena had learned not to push, though her curiosity never fully faded. One evening, as they sat together on her small balcony, watching the sun set over the city, Elena finally asked the question that had been building in her mind for weeks. Alexander, why are you so private about your work? He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the horizon, and Elena worried she had overstepped some invisible boundary. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight she had not heard from him before. It's not that I don't trust you, he said. It's that once you know, things change. People change, the way they see me, the way they treat me. I've grown tired of that happening before people get to know who I actually am. What do you mean things change? Elena asked, genuinely puzzled. Alexander sighed, running a hand through his hair, a rare display of visible frustration. There's a lot of expectation attached to what I do, a lot of assumptions people make. I wanted you to know me first, without any of that clouding things. You're being very mysterious, Elena said, trying to keep her tone light despite the growing unease settling in her chest. Are you in some kind of trouble? No, Alexander said quickly. his expression softening as he turned to look at her fully. "Nothing like that. I promise you, Elena. There's nothing dangerous or dishonest about what I'm keeping from you. It's just complicated, in ways that are hard to explain." Elena studied his face, searching for any hint of deception, and found only sincerity, mixed with something that looked almost like fear, though fear seemed like such an unlikely emotion for a man who had so calmly stood between her and Ryan on 2 separate occasions. "I trust you," she said finally, "but I hope eventually you'll trust me enough to tell me the truth." "I will," Alexander promised. "I just need a little more time." Elena nodded, deciding to let the matter rest for the evening, though the questions continued to linger at the back of her mind in the days that followed. She found herself paying closer attention to small details she had previously dismissed: the quality of his clothing, the deference of the restaurant staff who always seemed to know him, the way his driver addressed him with a formality that seemed excessive for a simple businessman. The truth, when it finally arrived, did not come from Alexander himself. It happened on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, while Elena and Nora were eating lunch in the small break room at their office. Nora was scrolling through a magazine someone had left on the table, flipping idly through the glossy pages, when she suddenly stopped, her eyes widening. "Elena," she said slowly, turning the magazine around to show her. "Is this him?" Elena's stomach dropped as she looked at the page. There, in a formal photograph accompanying an article about the country's wealthiest and most influential families, was Alexander, dressed in a dark suit, standing beside an elegant older woman Elena did not recognize. The caption beneath the photograph read, "Alexander Whitmore, Duke of Ashcombe, pictured with his mother, the Dowager Duchess Margaret Whitmore, at the annual charity gala." Elena stared at the words, reading them again and again, as though they might rearrange themselves into something that made more sense. Duke of Ashcombe. The title sat strangely against everything she thought she knew about him. The quiet man who listened to her talk about her paintings, who held her hand gently when she was frightened, who had never once given any indication of the life the article described. "That's him," Elena said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's definitely him." "Elena, he's a duke," Nora said, disbelief coloring her voice. "Like an actual duke. Did you know?" "No," Elena said, her mind spinning. "He told me he manages properties and investments. He never said anything about this." She read the article more closely, her hands trembling slightly as she absorbed details about Alexander's family, their extensive estates, their long history of wealth and influence stretching back generations. This was not simply a successful businessman she had been dating. This was a man from a completely different world, a world of titles and estates and public scrutiny that felt utterly foreign to the quiet, careful person she had come to know over the past few weeks. She thought about all the small moments that suddenly made more sense in this new light. The deference of restaurant staff, the quiet, watchful men who accompanied him, the expensive but understated way he dressed, as though wealth was simply an ordinary part of his existence rather than something to display. The careful way he had always deflected questions about his work. Elena felt a complicated mixture of emotions rising within her, betrayal chief among them, though she recognized, even in that moment, that Alexander had never actually lied to her. He had simply omitted, carefully and deliberately, an enormous part of who he was. "Are you going to talk to him about it?" Nora asked gently. "I don't know what I'm going to say," Elena admitted. "I don't even know what I'm feeling right now." She spent the rest of the workday distracted, her thoughts circling endlessly around the revelation, trying to reconcile the man she had come to trust with the title now attached to his name. By the time she left the office that evening, she had made up her mind to confront him directly, unable to bear carrying the weight of this discovery alone any longer. She called him on her walk home, and he answered almost immediately, his voice warm as always. "Elena, hello. I was just thinking about calling you." "We need to talk," Elena said, her voice tighter than she intended. "In person, if possible." There was a brief pause before Alexander responded, and Elena wondered if he could somehow sense the shift in her tone. "Of course. I can be at your apartment within the hour, if that works." "That's fine," Elena said, and ended the call before she could say anything more, needing time to gather her thoughts before facing him. The hour felt like an eternity. Elena paced her small apartment, rehearsing what she wanted to say. trying to sort through the tangled mess of emotions swirling inside her. Part of her understood his caution, understood the instinct to want to be known for himself rather than his title. But another part of her, the part still healing from months of deception and control at Ryan's hands, could not shake the feeling of having been kept in the dark about something so fundamentally important. When the knock finally came, Elena opened the door to find Alexander standing there, his expression carrying a quiet apprehension she had not seen from him before, as though he already suspected what this conversation was about. "You know," he said simply, before she could even speak. "I saw an article," Elena said, stepping back to let him inside, "about a charity gala, about the Duke of Ashcombe and his mother." Alexander's shoulders sagged slightly, a rare crack in his usually composed exterior. "Elena, I should have told you sooner. I'm sorry." "Why didn't you?" Elena asked, her voice cracking slightly, despite her efforts to remain calm. "Weeks, Alexander. We've been spending weeks together, and you never once mentioned that you're a duke." "Because the moment people find out, everything changes," Alexander said, his voice carrying a raw honesty she had not heard from him before. "They see the title before they see me. They calculate what they might gain, what doors might open, what advantages might come from being close to me. I wanted you to know me first, as just a man, before any of that could color how you saw me." "So you lied to me," Elena said quietly. "I never lied," Alexander said, his voice firm, despite the guilt evident in his expression. "Everything I told you about myself was true. I simply left out a part of it, a part I was afraid would change how you saw everything else." Elena crossed her arms, trying to steady the storm of emotions rising within her. "That's still deception, Alexander. Maybe not lying outright, but deception all the same." "You're right," Alexander admitted, and the simple, unguarded honesty of his response caught her off guard. "I was afraid, Elena. Afraid that if you knew from the beginning, you would see me differently, treat me differently, maybe even want something different from what genuinely exists between us. With you, for the first time in longer than I can remember, I felt like just a man, not a title, not an obligation, not a name attached to centuries of expectation, just Alexander." Elena felt her anger softening slightly at the vulnerability in his voice, though the hurt still lingered stubbornly beneath the surface. "I understand wanting that," she said quietly, "but you should have trusted me enough to tell me eventually, on your own terms, instead of letting me find out from a magazine article." "You're right," Alexander said again. "I'm sorry, Elena. Truly." They stood there in silence for a long moment, the weight of the revelation settling heavily between them. Elena studied his face, searching for the same sincerity she had always found there, and found it still present despite everything. "I need some time," she said finally, "to think about all of this." Alexander nodded, though the disappointment in his eyes was unmistakable. "I understand. Take whatever time you need. I'll be here when you're ready to talk again." He left shortly after, and Elena sank onto her couch, staring at the closed door, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and feelings. She thought about Ryan, about how thoroughly he had deceived her about his true nature, hiding his controlling tendencies behind a mask of charm until it was too late to easily escape. She did not believe Alexander was the same, not truly. But the fear of being deceived again, of trusting someone only to discover a hidden truth that changed everything, lingered stubbornly at the edges of her mind, refusing to be easily dismissed. As the evening wore on, Elena found herself staring at her phone, at the string of messages from Alexander over the past few weeks, each one a small piece of the connection they had built together. She did not know, in that moment, whether that connection was strong enough to survive this revelation, or whether the gap between their two worlds, hers so ordinary, his so extraordinary, would ultimately prove too wide to bridge. All she knew was that the simple, uncomplicated version of Alexander she had come to care for no longer existed in quite the same way. In its place stood a more complicated truth, one she would need time and courage to fully understand. Elena did not call Alexander for 4 days. She threw herself into work instead, staying late at the office, taking on extra projects, anything to keep her mind occupied, and away from the tangled mess of emotions his revelation had stirred up. Nora watched her carefully during this time, offering quiet support without pushing too hard, understanding that Elena needed space to process what had happened. "Have you talked to him?" Nora asked on the third day, setting a cup of tea on Elena's desk. "No," Elena admitted. "I don't know what to say." "What are you afraid of?" Nora asked gently. Elena considered the question seriously before answering. "I'm afraid that someone like him, with his wealth, his title, his entire world, could never really want a life with someone like me. I'm afraid this has all just been some kind of temporary escape for him, and eventually he'll go back to where he actually belongs, in that world I saw in the article, with people who understand that world in ways I never could." "Has he given you any reason to think that?" Nora asked. "No," Elena admitted. "He's been nothing but genuine with me, as far as I can tell. But I keep thinking about how differently everyone treated him once they realized who he was. The restaurant staff, his driver. Even Ryan seemed to hesitate once he sensed there was something more to Alexander than met the eye. I don't know how to exist in that kind of world." "Maybe you don't need to exist in his world," Nora said thoughtfully. "Maybe you just need to exist with him, and figure the rest out together." Elena turned the words over in her mind for the rest of the day, unable to shake the sense that Nora had touched on something important, something she had been too afraid to fully consider. That evening, as she walked home, her phone buzzed with a message. Not from Alexander, but from an unknown number. "I know about your Duke. Interesting how quickly you moved on. Ryan won't be happy to hear about this." Elena's blood ran cold. She stared at the message, reading it again and again, trying to understand what it meant. Ryan already knew about Alexander, but this message suggested someone else, someone she did not know, had also discovered the connection. Her phone buzzed again almost immediately. This could be very valuable information. "I'll be in touch." Elena's hands shook as she typed a response, demanding to know who this was, but the message went unanswered. She stood frozen on the sidewalk, fear creeping back into her chest, old and familiar, mixing uncomfortably with new uncertainty about what exactly this threat implied. She thought immediately of calling Alexander, but hesitated, still uncertain about where they stood after their unresolved conversation days earlier. But the fear of facing this alone outweighed her lingering hurt, and she found herself dialing his number before she had fully decided to do so. He answered immediately. "Elena." "I got a strange message," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "From someone I don't know. They mentioned you, mentioned your title. They said it could be valuable information, and that they'd be in touch." Alexander's voice sharpened immediately, all traces of the careful distance from their last conversation vanishing. "Can you send me the number?" "Yes," Elena said, forwarding the message immediately. "Elena, listen to me carefully," Alexander said, his tone urgent but controlled. "This sounds like it could be someone attempting to exploit our connection for financial gain, or worse, someone working with Ryan to cause trouble. I need you to be extremely careful. Don't respond to any further messages, and please, let me come to you." Despite her earlier uncertainty, Elena found herself agreeing, without hesitation, the 4 days of distance between them, suddenly feeling insignificant in the face of this new threat. Alexander arrived within 20 minutes, his expression tense in a way Elena had not seen before. He studied the messages on her phone carefully, his jaw tightening as he read them. "This number isn't familiar to me," he said. "But the timing, right after our conversation about my title, makes me think this might be connected to Ryan somehow. Perhaps he's found someone willing to help him profit from what he knows." "What does that mean for us?" Elena asked, her voice small. Alexander looked up from the phone, his expression softening as he met her eyes. "It means I need to take steps to protect you, and to figure out who is behind this before it goes any further. Elena, I know things have been complicated between us, and I understand if you're still upset with me, but please, let me help with this." Elena studied his face, seeing genuine concern there, mixed with something that looked like fear, not for himself, but for her. "I've missed you," she admitted quietly, surprising herself with the honesty of the confession. "These past 4 days have been harder than I expected." "I've missed you too," Alexander said, "more than I know how to express." They sat together on her couch, the tension of the unresolved conversation slowly easing as they talked through everything that had happened, the hurt of the deception, the fear stirred up by the mysterious message, the uncertainty about how their two very different worlds might fit together. "I don't know how to exist in your world," Elena admitted. "I saw that photograph, you standing beside your mother at some elegant gala, and I couldn't picture myself there at all. You don't have to fit into some predetermined image of what belongs in my world," Alexander said gently. "I don't want someone who fits some mold. I want you, exactly as you are." "Your mother might have different opinions about that," Elena said, only half joking. Alexander's expression grew more serious. "My mother can be difficult about certain expectations, it's true. But this is my life, Elena, and I intend to live it with the people who matter to me, regardless of anyone else's opinions." Elena felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of anxiety she had been carrying for days finally beginning to unravel. "I want to try," she said, "despite everything, despite my fear. I want to try to make this work." Alexander's smile, when it came, was one of genuine relief. "Thank you," he said softly. "I promise, from now on, complete honesty. No more secrets." They spent the rest of the evening discussing the mysterious message, trying to piece together who might be behind it. Alexander mentioned hiring additional security for Elena, a suggestion she initially resisted before recognizing the wisdom in taking the threat seriously. "I don't want to live in fear anymore," she said, "but I also don't want to be careless." "Then let's find a balance," Alexander said. "Precaution, without letting fear control your life. I think you've already proven, more than once, that you're capable of standing strong, even when things get difficult." Over the following days, Alexander arranged for a quiet security presence around Elena's apartment and workplace, careful to keep it unobtrusive, respecting her desire not to feel suffocated by protection. He also began making discreet inquiries about the source of the threatening message, though the trail proved frustratingly difficult to follow. Meanwhile, their relationship deepened in the wake of the crisis, the honesty Alexander had promised extending into every conversation they had. He told her more about his family, about the pressures of his position, about the complicated relationship he had with his mother, who had very specific ideas about who her son should marry and what kind of life he should lead. "She's going to have opinions about me," Elena said one evening, only half joking, as they sat together in her small kitchen, sharing a simple dinner she had cooked. "She has opinions about everything," Alexander said with a wry smile, "but her opinions don't dictate my choices, Elena. I want you to know that clearly." "I appreciate that," Elena said, "but I'd still like to meet her eventually. Properly, I mean. Not just as a photograph in a magazine." Alexander considered this for a moment, something thoughtful crossing his expression. "There's a family dinner coming up, actually. Nothing too formal, just close family. Would you be interested in coming with me?" Elena's stomach fluttered with a mixture of nervousness and determination. "I think I would," she said. "I want to understand this part of your life, Alexander. Even if it's intimidating." "You don't need to be intimidated," Alexander said, reaching across the table to take her hand gently. "You've handled far more difficult things than a dinner with my family." Elena laughed softly, though the nervousness remained. "I suppose that's true." As the days passed, the threatening messages did not resume, though the sense of unresolved danger lingered at the edges of their newfound happiness, a reminder that Ryan, and whoever he had allied himself with, remained a threat waiting to resurface. But for the moment, Elena allowed herself to focus on the positive developments in her life, on the deepening trust between her and Alexander, on the tentative hope that perhaps their two very different worlds could find a way to coexist. She thought often about Nora's words, about not needing to fit into Alexander's world, but simply existing with him, and figuring the rest out together. It was a philosophy she was slowly learning to embrace, one careful step at a time, even as the shadow of old dangers continued to lurk somewhere just beyond the edges of her vision, waiting for the right moment to resurface and test the strength of everything they were building together. The Whitmore family estate sat at the end of a long, tree-lined drive, an imposing structure of gray stone that seemed to belong to another century entirely. Elena's stomach churned with nerves as the car approached, the sheer scale of the building making her acutely aware of how far this world was from the small apartment she called home. "You look nervous," Alexander said, glancing at her from the seat beside her. "I am nervous," Elena admitted. "This place looks like something out of a history book." "It's just a house," Alexander said. though the small smile playing at the corner of his mouth suggested he understood exactly how intimidating it must appear to someone seeing it for the first time. Just a house, Elena repeated skeptically, staring up at the building as the car came to a stop in front of the wide stone steps leading to the entrance. A butler greeted them at the door, his manner formal, but not unkind, leading them through a grand entrance hall lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, whose eyes seemed to follow Elena as she walked past. She fought the urge to reach for Alexander's hand, not wanting to appear as nervous as she felt, though he seemed to sense her anxiety anyway, offering a reassuring glance as they made their way toward the dining room. Alexander's mother, the Dowager Duchess Margaret Whitmore, was already seated at the long dining table when they entered, her posture perfectly straight, her expression carefully neutral, as she assessed Elena with a single sweeping glance. "Alexander," she said, rising to greet her son with a brief embrace, before turning her attention fully to Elena. "And this must be the young woman you've mentioned." "Mother, this is Elena," Alexander said, his voice carrying a note of protective firmness that Elena appreciated, even as her nerves threatened to overwhelm her. "Elena, my mother, Margaret. Pleasure to meet you," Elena said, extending her hand, which the Duchess shook with a grip that was firm but brief. "Likewise," Margaret said, her tone polite but not particularly warm. "Please, sit. Dinner will be served shortly." The meal that followed was an exercise in careful navigation for Elena, who found herself constantly aware of which fork to use, how to hold herself, how to answer the pointed questions Margaret posed throughout the evening, with a directness that bordered on interrogation. "Alexander tells me you work in marketing," Margaret said at one point, her tone carrying a subtle edge that suggested the profession did not entirely meet with her approval.
"Yes," Elena said, keeping her voice steady despite the underlying judgment she sensed in the question.
"I've worked at the same firm for about 3 years now. I enjoy it." "And your family?" Margaret pressed. "What do they do?" "My parents run a small shop in the town where I grew up," Elena said. "Nothing particularly grand, but honest work." Margaret's expression remained carefully neutral, though Elena noticed a slight tightening around her eyes that suggested the answer was not quite what she had hoped for. "How quaint," she said, and though the words were polite, something in her tone made them feel like anything but a compliment. Alexander, seated beside Elena, reached under the table to take her hand, a small gesture of support that helped steady her nerves. "Elena's paintings are quite remarkable, Mother," he said, deliberately steering the conversation in a more positive direction. "You should see them sometime." "Perhaps," Margaret said non-committally, though her eyes had softened slightly at her son's obvious affection for Elena, even if she was not yet ready to fully express approval. The dinner continued through several more courses, Margaret's questions gradually becoming slightly less pointed as the evening progressed, though the underlying scrutiny never fully disappeared. Elena found herself exhausted by the end of the meal, the constant effort of navigating unfamiliar social rules and careful judgment, leaving her feeling drained in a way that had nothing to do with the excellent food. After dinner, as they moved to a sitting room for coffee, Margaret finally addressed the situation more directly, waiting until Alexander had briefly left the room to speak with the butler about some minor matter. "My son cares for you a great deal," Margaret said, studying Elena with an expression that was difficult to read. "I can see that clearly." "I care for him too," Elena said honestly. "Do you understand what you would be taking on if this relationship continues?" Margaret asked. "The scrutiny, the expectations, the constant public attention. It is not an easy life, Elena. Many who enter this world find themselves unable to bear its weight." Elena considered the question seriously before answering. "I won't pretend I fully understand it yet," she said. "This world is very new to me, and I won't lie and say it doesn't intimidate me. But I care about Alexander, not his title or his estate. If those things come with him, then I want to learn how to navigate them, for his sake." Margaret studied her for a long moment, something shifting, almost imperceptibly in her expression. "That is, at least, an honest answer," she said finally. "Many would have simply told me what they thought I wanted to hear." "I'd rather be honest," Elena said, "even if it's not always the easiest answer." "Alexander has always had good instincts about people," Margaret said, almost to herself. "Perhaps I should trust that more than I have been." Before Elena could respond, Alexander returned to the room, glancing between the two women, with evident curiosity about what had transpired in his absence. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Perfectly fine," Margaret said, her tone giving nothing away, though Elena thought she caught the faintest hint of approval in the older woman's expression, as their eyes met briefly. The remainder of the evening passed more comfortably than the earlier portions, the tension gradually easing as Margaret asked Elena more genuine questions about her art, her interests, her hopes for the future, rather than the pointed interrogation of earlier in the evening. By the time Alexander and Elena finally departed, the sun had long since set, and Elena felt a cautious sense of relief at having survived her first formal introduction to Alexander's family, relatively unscathed. "That went better than I expected," Alexander said, as they settled into the car for the drive home. "Your mother is intense," Elena said with a tired laugh. "She can be," Alexander agreed. "But I think she liked you, in her own way. That's rarer than you might think." "I hope so," Elena said, leaning her head against the window, exhaustion finally catching up with her, after the long evening of careful navigation. Alexander reached over and took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles against her palm. "You handled tonight beautifully," he said. "I know it wasn't easy." "It wasn't," Elena admitted. "But I want to keep trying, Alexander. For you, and for whatever this is becoming between us." "For us," Alexander corrected gently, and Elena felt her heart swell at the simple, deliberate certainty in those two words. As the car carried them back toward the city, away from the imposing grandeur of the family estate, Elena allowed herself to think, for the first time, about what a future with Alexander might actually look like. The world he came from was vast and unfamiliar, full of expectations and scrutiny she was only beginning to understand. But beside him, holding his hand in the quiet darkness of the car, she felt something she had not expected to feel again after everything with Ryan. She felt hopeful. The thread of the mysterious message still lingered somewhere in the back of her mind, an unresolved danger waiting to resurface. But for tonight, at least, Elena allowed herself to simply exist in the warmth of this new, uncertain, but genuinely hopeful chapter of her life, trusting that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would not have to face them alone. The peace did not last long. 2 weeks after the dinner at the family estate, Elena received another message from the same unknown number that had contacted her before. This time, the message was more direct, more threatening in its implications. "I have information that could damage the Duke's reputation significantly. Photos, details about his relationship with you, and other matters he would prefer stayed private. I'm willing to keep quiet, for a price. 50,000, and this all goes away." Elena stared at the message, her hands trembling as she read it again and again. She immediately called Alexander, who arrived at her apartment within the hour, his expression grim as he read the message on her phone. "This is definitely connected to Ryan somehow," he said, his jaw tight with barely restrained anger. "I need to bring in people who can help trace this properly." "What do you mean by other matters?" Elena asked, her voice small. "What could they possibly have on you?" Alexander's expression flickered with something that looked almost like discomfort. "I don't know exactly," he admitted. "It could be nothing more than an empty threat designed to scare us into paying. Blackmail attempts often exaggerate what they actually have." "But you're not certain," Elena pressed. "No," Alexander admitted. "I'm not certain." Over the following days, Alexander brought in a team of lawyers and security specialists to investigate the threat, working carefully to trace the source of the messages without alerting whoever was behind them. Elena found herself drawn into a world of quiet, careful strategy sessions in Alexander's offices, meetings with serious-faced professionals who spoke in careful, measured tones about legal protections and digital forensics. Mr. Hughes, the family's longtime lawyer, was particularly thorough in his approach, walking Elena and Alexander through the various legal options available to them, should the blackmail attempt escalate further. "Whoever is behind this clearly hopes to profit from information they believe would embarrass the family," Hughes explained during one such meeting. "Our best approach is twofold. First, we identify the source. Second, we prepare a legal response strong enough to discourage any actual attempt to follow through on their threats." "And if they do follow through?" Elena asked, If they release whatever they claim to have, then we address it directly and honestly, Alexander said, before Hughes could answer. I won't be blackmailed into silence, and I won't let fear of scandal dictate how I live my life, or who I choose to be with. Elena felt a surge of gratitude at his firm declaration, though the underlying anxiety about what exactly this mysterious blackmailer might reveal continued to gnaw at her. She thought about the photograph from the magazine article, about the vast difference between her ordinary life and Alexander's extraordinary one, and wondered what kind of secrets might exist in that gap, secrets significant enough to warrant such an elaborate threat. The investigation, led quietly by a security specialist named Daniel, eventually uncovered a connection that confirmed their suspicions. The unknown number tracing back to a man named Victor, a small-time journalist with a history of exploiting personal information for financial gain, who had somehow connected with Ryan through mutual acquaintances after Ryan's confrontation with Alexander at Elena's office weeks earlier. Ryan approached Victor after his encounter with you, Daniel explained, during a meeting at Alexander's office. He apparently offered information about your relationship in exchange for a cut of whatever profit Victor could extract through blackmail or selling the story to tabloids. Elena felt sick at the revelation, at the confirmation that Ryan, having failed to control her directly, had resorted to trying to profit from and potentially destroy the new happiness she had found. He's really willing to go this far, she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else in the room. We won't let him succeed, Alexander said firmly, reaching over to take her hand. Daniel, what are our options for addressing this directly? We have several, Daniel said. We can pursue legal action against both Ryan and Victor for attempted extortion, which would likely result in serious consequences for both of them. Alternatively, we could attempt a quieter resolution, though given the pattern of behavior we've seen from Ryan specifically, I'm not confident a quiet resolution would actually stop him. I don't want quiet anymore, Elena said suddenly, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. I'm tired of hiding, of moving, of changing my number, of trying to avoid confrontation. If pursuing this legally is what it takes to finally stop him, then that's what I want to do. Alexander looked at her with evident pride, squeezing her hand gently. Then that's what we'll do. The following weeks brought a whirlwind of legal proceedings, careful evidence gathering, and mounting tension as the case against Ryan and Victor began to take shape. Elena found herself giving statements to lawyers, reviewing documented evidence of Ryan's pattern of harassment stretching back over a year, and steeling herself for what promised to be a difficult and public confrontation. Alexander remained a steady presence throughout the process, attending every meeting she would allow him to attend, offering quiet support during the moments when the weight of everything threatened to overwhelm her. His family's resources, once a source of intimidation for Elena, now became a source of genuine relief, providing access to skilled lawyers and thorough investigators who might otherwise have been financially out of reach. I never imagined fighting back could actually work, Elena admitted one evening, as they reviewed the mounting evidence together in Alexander's study. For so long, it felt like there was nothing I could do except run and hide. You were doing the best you could with the resources you had, Alexander said gently. There's no shame in that. But you don't have to face this alone anymore, Elena. Not when there are ways to actually stop him. Meanwhile, whispers about the situation had begun circulating within Alexander's social circles, despite their careful attempts to keep the investigation quiet. Margaret called one evening, her voice carrying an unusual note of concern. I've heard rumors, she said without preamble. Something about extortion attempts related to Elena's former partner, Alexander. Is this true? It's true, Alexander admitted. We're handling it, Mother. Elena has been remarkably brave throughout this entire process. There was a pause on the line before Margaret spoke again, her tone softer than Elena had heard from her before. I would like to help, if there's anything I can do. This family has resources beyond just legal representation, Alexander. Connections that might prove useful. Elena, listening to Alexander's side of the conversation, felt a warm surprise at this unexpected offer of support from a woman who had initially seemed so skeptical of her presence in Alexander's life. Thank you, Mother, Alexander said. I'll let you know if we need anything further. After ending the call, Alexander turned to Elena with a small, surprised smile. It seems my mother has decided to fully support you, he said. That's not something she offers easily. I'm grateful, Elena said, genuinely touched by the gesture, even if I'm still a little intimidated by her. She has a way of growing on people, Alexander said with a laugh. Eventually. As the investigation progressed and the legal case against Ryan and Victor solidified, Elena felt a gradual shift within herself. A transformation from the frightened woman who had grabbed a stranger's arm in a crowded train station months earlier into someone stronger, more determined, more willing to stand and fight rather than simply run and hide. She knew the road ahead would not be easy. Public exposure of the situation seemed increasingly likely, given the mounting evidence and the seriousness of the charges being prepared against Ryan and Victor. But for the first time since Ryan had first begun his campaign of harassment, Elena felt something other than fear guiding her actions. She felt determination, and beside her, steady and unwavering, stood Alexander, ready to face whatever consequences might come. Together. The story broke on a Tuesday morning, splashed across the entertainment section of a national tabloid, with a headline that made Elena's stomach turn the moment she saw it. Duke's secret romance involves dangerous stalker scandal, the headline read, accompanied by a photograph of Elena and Alexander leaving the restaurant where they had shared their first dinner together weeks earlier. Victor had followed through on his threat, apparently deciding that selling the story to a tabloid was more profitable, or perhaps more satisfying, than continuing to demand payment directly. The article was a mixture of half-truths and outright fabrications, painting Elena as a woman who had manipulated her way into Alexander's life, while conveniently omitting any mention of Ryan's extensive history of harassment. Elena's phone began buzzing incessantly within minutes of the article's publication, messages from concerned friends, curious acquaintances, and even a few numbers she did not recognize, presumably other journalists hoping to capitalize on the sudden public interest in her private life. "This is a nightmare," she said to Alexander over the phone, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Everyone at work has probably seen this by now." "Elena, listen to me," Alexander said, his voice calm despite the chaos she could hear evident in the background of wherever he was calling from. "We knew this was a possibility. We prepared for it. This doesn't change anything about how I feel about you, or about our commitment to fighting back against Ryan and Victor. But now everyone knows," Elena said. "Everyone is going to have opinions about me, about us, about everything. Let them," Alexander said firmly. "Their opinions don't determine our reality, Elena. What matters is the truth, and we're going to make sure the truth comes out clearly." True to his word, within hours of the tabloid story's publication, Alexander's team released a carefully worded statement addressing the situation directly, outlining the extensive history of harassment Elena had endured from Ryan, the legal proceedings already underway, and firmly denouncing the tabloid's misleading portrayal of events. The statement helped somewhat, shifting some of the public narrative towards sympathy for Elena rather than suspicion, though the damage of the initial article could not be fully undone. Elena found herself the subject of curious glances and whispered conversations at work, though Nora and her other close co-workers rallied around her with fierce loyalty, defending her against any lingering doubts among their colleagues. "You don't owe anyone an explanation," Nora said firmly during lunch one day, noticing Elena's evident distress at the ongoing attention. "What matters is that you're safe, and that Ryan finally faces consequences for everything he's done. I just hate feeling like my entire life is suddenly public knowledge," Elena admitted. Everything that happened with Ryan, everything painful and personal, now splashed across tabloids for strangers to gossip about. "It's temporary," Nora reminded her. "The news cycle moves fast. Something else will capture everyone's attention soon enough." Elena hoped Nora was right, though the constant scrutiny weighed heavily on her in the days that followed. Alexander remained a steady, unwavering presence throughout the ordeal, refusing to distance himself from her despite the pressure evident from certain corners of his social circle, some of whom apparently believed the scandal reflected poorly on the family's reputation. "There are people advising me to end things with you," Alexander admitted one evening, as they sat together in his study, the tension of the past week evident in the careful way he chose his words. "People who believe this situation is too messy, too public, too damaging to continue." Elena felt her chest tighten with old, familiar fear. "And what do you think?" "I think those people are wrong," Alexander said firmly, meeting her eyes with unwavering certainty. "I think you've shown more courage throughout this entire ordeal than anyone I've ever known. I think Ryan is the one who should be facing consequences and public scrutiny, not you, and I have absolutely no intention of distancing myself from you, regardless of what anyone advises." Elena felt tears prick at her eyes, overwhelmed by the depth of his loyalty. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what I would have done without your support through all of this." "You would have found a way," Alexander said gently. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for. But I'm glad I don't have to find out, because I intend to stay right here beside you." The legal case against Ryan and Victor continued to progress in the following weeks, bolstered significantly by the public attention the tabloid article had generated, which brought forward additional witnesses willing to testify about Ryan's pattern of harassment that Elena had not even been aware of. A former co-worker of Ryan's came forward with details about his controlling behavior in a previous relationship. A neighbor from Elena's old apartment complex confirmed multiple instances of Ryan loitering outside her building despite the restraining order. The mounting evidence painted a damning picture, one that gradually shifted public opinion further in Elena's favor, as the initial tabloid narrative crumbled under scrutiny. Victor, facing serious legal consequences for the extortion attempt, eventually agreed to cooperate with authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence, providing detailed evidence of his collaboration with Ryan that strengthened the case significantly. Throughout this period, Alexander used his resources carefully and deliberately, not to manipulate the situation unfairly, but to ensure Elena had access to the best possible legal representation and protection. He arranged additional security for her apartment and workplace, ensured her legal team had every resource necessary to build the strongest possible case, and remained a constant, visible presence beside her at every court appearance and legal proceeding. "I keep thinking about how different this feels from everything with Ryan," Elena admitted one evening, as they walked together through a quiet park near her apartment, seeking a brief respite from the ongoing legal proceedings. "With him, I always felt like I was fighting alone, like no one believed me or took the danger seriously. With you, I feel like I actually have a chance." "You always had the strength to fight," Alexander said. "I've just been fortunate enough to help provide the resources to make that fight more effective." "It's more than that," Elena said, stopping to face him fully. "You've never once tried to control the situation, or control me. You've simply supported whatever choices I've made, even when those choices were difficult or risky. That's such a different experience from anything I knew with Ryan." Alexander reached up to gently brush a strand of hair from her face, his expression soft with genuine affection. "That's because I respect you, Elena. I respect your strength, your intelligence, your right to make your own decisions about your own life. I never wanted to be someone who controlled you. I only ever wanted to be someone who supported you." Elena felt the last remaining traces of her earlier hesitation about their relationship, about the vast differences between their two worlds, finally dissolve completely. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever public scrutiny or family pressure they might continue to face, she felt certain, standing there in the quiet park with Alexander's hand gently cupping her face, that they would face it together, as genuine equals rather than as rescuer and rescued. The legal proceedings against Ryan and Victor were scheduled to reach their conclusion within the coming weeks, promising to finally bring the extended nightmare of harassment and extortion to a definitive close. Elena felt a cautious sense of hope building within her, a belief that justice, so elusive for so long, might finally be within reach. But even as that hope grew, a small, persistent worry remained at the back of her mind. Ryan had proven, time and again, that he was capable of finding new ways to cause trouble when his previous attempts failed. Elena could not shake the feeling that the true resolution of this long, difficult chapter of her life had not yet fully arrived, that one final confrontation still awaited her before she could truly claim the peace and happiness that seemed, for the first time, genuinely within her reach. The morning of the final court hearing arrived gray and overcast, matching the tense anticipation that had settled over Elena in the days leading up to this moment. She stood outside the courthouse with Alexander beside her, her hands cold despite the mild autumn weather, watching as a small crowd of reporters gathered near the entrance, drawn by the public interest the case had generated over the preceding weeks. "Are you ready for this?" Alexander asked quietly, his hand finding hers, as they prepared to walk toward the entrance. I don't know if I'll ever feel fully ready, Elena admitted. But I need this to be over. I need to finally close this chapter. Inside the courtroom, Elena took her seat beside her lawyer, glancing briefly toward the opposite side of the room where Ryan sat, his expression a mixture of defiance and barely concealed anxiety. Victor sat nearby, his posture slumped, evidently resigned to whatever consequences awaited him following his cooperation with the investigation. The proceedings unfolded methodically over the following hours, evidence presented with careful precision by the legal team Alexander had assembled. Elena listened as witness after witness testified to Ryan's pattern of controlling, threatening behavior, stretching back well before their relationship had even fully ended. She heard, for the first time, testimony from people whose experiences with Ryan she had never known about, further confirming the troubling pattern that had defined so much of her relationship with him. When it came time for Elena herself to testify, she felt her heart racing, old fears resurfacing, despite the months of preparation and support that had led to this moment. But as she took her seat and began recounting her experiences, starting from the earliest signs of Ryan's controlling behavior through to the desperate moment at the train station that had first brought her into contact with Alexander, she felt a surprising strength settling over her, a clarity of purpose that steadied her voice even as difficult memories surfaced. I spent months living in fear, she said, addressing the court directly. Moving apartments, changing my number, constantly looking over my shoulder. I want the court to understand that this wasn't simply a difficult breakup. This was a sustained campaign of harassment that fundamentally altered how I was able to live my life. Ryan's lawyer attempted to challenge her testimony, suggesting that her relationship with Alexander had somehow been calculated or opportunistic, an attempt to discredit her account by painting her as manipulative rather than genuinely frightened. But the accumulated evidence, the testimony of multiple independent witnesses, and the clear documentation of Ryan's escalating behavior made the defense's arguments increasingly difficult to sustain. By the time the final arguments concluded and the court adjourned to deliberate, Elena felt emotionally drained, but also, for the first time in longer than she could remember, genuinely hopeful about the outcome. Alexander remained beside her throughout the tense waiting period, his steady presence a source of comfort, even as the uncertainty of the verdict weighed heavily on both of them.
Whatever happens,
Alexander said quietly, as they waited in a private room provided for them away from the crowded courthouse hallways, I want you to know how proud I am of you. The courage it took to stand up there and share everything you've been through, that's not something everyone could do. I couldn't have done it without your support, Elena said honestly, without knowing I had someone in my corner who genuinely believed me. You would have found the strength regardless, Alexander said. I've simply had the privilege of witnessing it. When the court finally reconvened to deliver the verdict, Elena's heart pounded so loudly, she was certain everyone in the room could hear it. The judge's words seemed to stretch endlessly as the verdict was read, finding Ryan guilty of sustained harassment and stalking, with additional charges against both Ryan and Victor for the attempted extortion scheme. The sentencing, delivered shortly after, included significant legal consequences for both men, along with permanent restraining orders that Elena hoped would finally provide the lasting protection she had sought for so long. As the verdict was announced, Elena felt an overwhelming wave of relief wash over her, tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks, after months of carefully controlled composure. Alexander wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, as the weight of the long, difficult ordeal finally began to lift from her shoulders. It's over, she whispered, almost unable to believe the words, even as she spoke them. It's actually over. It's over, Alexander confirmed, his voice thick with emotion as he held her. You did this, Elena. Your courage did this. Outside the courthouse, the crowd of reporters had grown larger, eager for reaction to the verdict. Alexander's team had prepared a brief statement for Elena to deliver if she chose to address the media, though the decision remained entirely hers. Elena took a deep breath, steadying herself, before stepping forward to face the assembled reporters, Alexander standing supportively beside her, but allowing her to speak for herself. For months, I lived in fear, she said, her voice steady, despite the emotion still coursing through her. I want anyone who might be experiencing something similar to know that speaking up, seeking help, and refusing to stay silent can lead to real justice. I'm grateful for the support that made this possible. And I'm grateful, most of all, that this chapter of fear and uncertainty is finally behind me. The statement, brief but powerful, was picked up widely by news outlets in the following days, gradually shifting the public narrative fully in Elena's favor, transforming her from the subject of tabloid speculation into someone widely admired for her courage and resilience. In the weeks that followed the verdict, Elena felt herself gradually settling into a new sense of peace, one built not on the absence of danger, but on the genuine resolution of a threat that had shadowed her life for far too long. She returned to her painting with renewed enthusiasm, finding inspiration in the strength she had discovered within herself throughout the difficult months of the legal proceedings. Margaret, upon hearing of the verdict, sent Elena a handwritten note expressing genuine admiration for her courage, a gesture that touched Elena deeply, given the initial reservations the Duchess had shown during their first meeting. "I told you she would come around eventually," Alexander said with a satisfied smile, when Elena showed him the note. "I'm grateful," Elena said, "for everything, Alexander. This entire journey, difficult as it was, led me somewhere I never expected to be, somewhere genuinely happy." "We're just getting started," Alexander said, his eyes carrying a warmth and certainty that made Elena's heart swell with anticipation for whatever came next in their shared journey together. As autumn gave way to the first cool days of winter, Elena found herself reflecting often on how dramatically her life had changed since that desperate moment at the train station, grabbing a stranger's arm in a moment of panic, never imagining that simple act of survival would lead her toward a love and a strength she had never known she was capable of finding. Ryan's shadow, once so dominant in her daily existence, had finally receded into the past, replaced by a future that felt genuinely bright with possibility, for the first time, in longer than Elena could remember. And beside her, steady and unwavering through every difficult moment of the journey, stood Alexander, ready to continue building whatever future awaited them together. Winter settled gently over the city, bringing with it a quiet, contented rhythm to Elena's days that felt almost unfamiliar after the turmoil of the preceding months. She had returned fully to her work, her paintings finding their way into a small local gallery that had offered to display several pieces after a chance encounter with the gallery owner, a connection Elena was quietly proud to have made, entirely on her own merit, rather than through any influence from Alexander's world. Her relationship with Alexander had deepened steadily since the conclusion of the legal proceedings, the trust between them growing stronger with each passing week. He had kept his promise of complete honesty, sharing openly about the responsibilities and pressures of his position, introducing her gradually to more of his world, his friends, the various obligations that came with his title. Elena found herself growing more comfortable in that world with each visit, no longer feeling like an outsider peering in, but rather like someone gradually finding her own place within it. Margaret's initial reservations had softened considerably, evolving into what Elena now recognized as genuine warmth, even if the Duchess remained naturally reserved in her expressions of affection. "You've changed him, you know," Margaret said one afternoon, during a visit to the estate that had become a regular occurrence over the past months. "He seems happier than I've seen him in years." "He's changed me too," Elena said honestly. "I don't think I would have found the strength to fight for myself the way I did without his support." "You had that strength already," Margaret said, echoing words Elena had heard from Alexander himself months earlier. "He simply helped create the space for it to emerge." Elena smiled at the observation, recognizing the truth in it, even as she remained grateful for everything Alexander had done to support her throughout the difficult journey. Their relationship had evolved into something built on genuine partnership, rather than the dynamic of rescuer and rescued that had characterized their earliest interactions. A partnership Elena treasured, precisely because it felt equal, mutual, and built on authentic respect rather than dependency. One crisp December evening, Alexander invited her to dinner, at the same quiet restaurant where they had shared their very first meal together months earlier. The place where Elena had first begun to understand that this stranger from the train station might become something far more significant in her life than she had initially imagined. "This feels familiar," Elena said with a soft smile, as they were seated at a corner table, the same understated elegance surrounding them that she remembered from that first evening. I thought it might be fitting, Alexander said, his expression carrying a nervous energy Elena had rarely seen from him, a departure from his usual calm composure that immediately caught her attention. Is everything all right? She asked, studying him with growing curiosity. Everything is more than all right, Alexander said, reaching across the table to take her hand. Elena, these past months have been the most meaningful of my entire life. From that first desperate moment at the train station, when you grabbed my arm and asked me to pretend to be someone I wasn't, to everything we've been through together since, you've shown me a kind of courage and authenticity I never expected to find. Elena felt her heart quicken, sensing the significance building in his words, even before he continued. I've spent my entire life surrounded by expectation, by people who saw my title before they saw me, Alexander continued. But you never once cared about any of that. You cared about the man behind the title, and you loved me not despite everything I had to offer, but simply for who I actually am. That's rarer than you might realize, and I don't intend to take it for granted. He reached into his coat pocket, producing a small velvet box that he opened carefully to reveal a simple, elegant ring, understated in exactly the way Elena had come to associate with Alexander's genuine character, rather than the ostentatious wealth others might have expected from someone of his position. Elena Marsh, he said, his voice steady, despite the visible emotion in his eyes. Will you marry me? Elena felt tears spilling down her cheeks, overwhelmed by the depth of emotion in the moment, by the journey that had brought them to this point, from fear and desperation to genuine, hard-won happiness. Yes, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, Alexander. Absolutely yes. The small restaurant erupted into quiet, warm applause from the other diners who had witnessed the proposal, and Alexander slid the ring onto her finger, with hands that trembled slightly, despite his usual composure. He pulled her into an embrace, and Elena felt, in that moment, the full weight of everything they had overcome together, finally settling into a sense of profound, well-earned peace. I love you, Alexander said softly, his forehead resting against hers. Not the version of you that needed rescuing, but the version of you that fought and survived and built something real out of the wreckage of everything that came before. That's who I'm asking to spend my life with. I love you too, Elena said, for seeing me, truly seeing me, from that very first moment at the train station. As they sat together afterward, celebrating quietly over the remainder of their dinner, Elena found her thoughts drifting back over the entire journey that had led her to this moment. The desperate fear of that first encounter with Ryan at the train station, the quiet strength Alexander had shown in stepping in to help a frightened stranger, the gradual unraveling of his carefully guarded secret, and the painful, necessary conversation that had followed. The threat of blackmail and public scandal that had tested their commitment to each other, the long, difficult path toward justice that had finally freed her from the shadow of fear that had defined so much of her recent past. Through every difficult moment, she realized, she had grown stronger, not because Alexander had rescued her from her problems, but because he had stood beside her while she found the strength to face them herself. That distinction, she understood now, made all the difference between the unhealthy dynamic she had endured with Ryan and the genuine partnership she had built with Alexander. In the months that followed their engagement, Elena continued to build her own identity within Alexander's world, her paintings gaining modest recognition beyond the small local gallery that had first displayed her work, her confidence growing steadily as she learned to navigate the responsibilities and expectations that would eventually come with becoming Alexander's wife. Their wedding, when it finally took place the following spring, was a careful balance between the grandeur expected of Alexander's position and the intimate, genuine warmth that had always defined their relationship. Elena walked down the aisle, not as a frightened woman seeking rescue, but as a confident equal partner, ready to build a shared future with a man who had earned her trust not through his title or his wealth, but through his consistent, unwavering respect for her strength and independence. Margaret, seated in the front row, wept openly during the ceremony, her earlier reservations long since replaced by genuine affection and pride for the woman her son had chosen. Nora served as one of Elena's bridesmaids, beaming with happiness for her friend's remarkable journey from fear to genuine joy. As Elena and Alexander exchanged their vows, promising to support and respect each other as equal partners through whatever challenges the future might bring. Elena felt the last remaining traces of the fear that had once defined her life finally dissolve completely, replaced by a deep, abiding sense of security and hope. Ryan remained, by this point, nothing more than a distant memory, a painful chapter in a story that had ultimately led her somewhere far better than she could have ever imagined during those desperate, frightening months of harassment and fear. The stranger she had grabbed at a crowded train station, not knowing he was a duke, had become not her rescuer, but her equal, her partner, and now, finally, her husband. Standing together as newly married partners, surrounded by family and friends who had witnessed their remarkable journey, Elena and Alexander looked toward a future built not on fear or desperation, but on genuine love, mutual respect, and the hard-won strength that had carried them both through every challenge along the way. Their story, which had begun with a desperate act of survival in a crowded train station, had finally found its true resolution, not in rescue, but in partnership, not in fear, but in courage, and not in hiding from the world, but in facing it together, fully and completely, as equals ready to build whatever future awaited them next.